On a mid-afternoon in the summer of 1944, a young American lieutenant watched the man he admired most in the world fall out of the sky inside a burning airplane. Major Burt Marshall, his squadron commander, Anache, a leader who always flew at the front, was going down behind German lines in occupied France. Black smoke poured from the engine of his Mustang as it dropped toward a field of golden wheat. In a matter of minutes, Marshall would either be dead or a prisoner of war for the rest of the conflict. Lieutenant Royce Priest was 21 years old. He had only 2 months of combat behind him. Every rule, every regulation, every voice of reason told him exactly what to do next. Mark the location, radio the coordinates, turn for home. The Mustang was a single-seat fighter. There was no room for a passenger. There was no procedure for what he was about to attempt. There was no training for it. Because no one believed it could ever be done, his commander's voice crackled over the radio, ordering him to abort. Priest reached for the switch. Then his hand stopped in the air. What he chose to do in the next 10 minutes would either end in 2 graves in a foreign field or become one of the most impossible rescues in the entire history of the air war. And it would leave a famous general with a decision he never expected to face. Before we dive in, get comfortable and grab your favorite warm drink. No, check the time. What does your clock say right now? Leave it in the comments. And let's step back into World War II together. The summer of 1944 was a season of quiet loss for the American flyers based in England. By the middle of August, the 8th Air Force was bleeding pilots over occupied France at a rate that nobody back home wanted to talk about. The bombers still went out in their great droning formations, and the fighters still climbed up to shepherd them across the enemy coast. But every mission carried its own hidden arithmetic. Men left in the cold light of morning, and by the time the evening mess filled up, a certain number of chairs stayed empty. No one said much. There was nothing much to say. The Germans had become masters of hiding. Their anti-aircraft crews had learned a hard lesson in the first years of the war. A gun in the open was a gun that died quickly under the machine guns of a diving fighter, so they stopped fighting in the open. They tucked their weapons inside haystacks that were not really haystacks. They built false walls into the sides of quiet farm buildings. They parked railway cars on lonely sidings and painted the great red cross of the medical service across their wooden flanks. And then they waited, patient as spiders, for the American fighters to come down low where the killing was easy and the dying was quick. The 355th Fighter Group had felt that arithmetic more sharply than most in the span of only 2 months. The group had lost more than a dozen of its pilots. Some had died in a single heartbeat, a lone shell finding an engine or a cockpit before the man inside ever understood what had reached up to touch him. Others had walked away from crash landings in enemy fields, hands raised, only to spend the rest of the war behind the wire of a prison camp far to the east. And a few had simply vanished. Their names were moved from one list to another, from the living to the missing, and their true fates were never learned by anyone who came home. Major Burt Marshall did not have to fly on the afternoon that changed everything. As the commanding officer of the 354th Fighter Squadron, he could have handed the mission to one of his flight leaders and stayed on the ground with a perfectly clear conscience. That was simply not the kind of man he was. Marshall had built his whole reputation on sharing every risk he asked of his men, on being the first airplane down into the danger and the last one to pull away from it. His men noticed. Men always notice which of their leaders send them out and which of their leaders go with them. He had arrived at the squadron only a short while earlier with almost no time at all in the Mustang, having crossed over from an older, heavier fighter with barely a handful of hours in the sleek new machine. Yet war has a way of teaching a willing man very quickly. His second combat mission had fallen on the morning of the Great Invasion, and over the churning beaches of Normandy he had shot a German dive bomber out of the sky Within 2 weeks, he had destroyed 2 more enemy fighters in swirling low battles. By the first days of August, he had become an ace, one of the fastest the group had ever produced, and his hungry, aggressive way of flying had carried him upward through the ranks at a speed that left far older men blinking in his wake. Pilot to flight leader in a matter of days, flight leader to operations officer. Inside 2 weeks, operations officer to squadron commander in less than 2 months. The same fierce instinct that made him climb so fast was now about to drop him into a burning cockpit above enemy soil. There was a young lieutenant in that very same squadron who had known the name Bert Marshall long before either of them ever saw a shooting war. His name was Royce Priest, and he was 21 years old. Back home, Marshall had been a schoolboy legend, a star quarterback whose name filled the sports pages across the wide state of Texas, and later a college athlete of real and recognized distinction. When Priest learned that fate had assigned him to the very squadron this man now commanded, he counted it the single luckiest turn of his young military life. He watched the older man the way a student watches a master. He copied the way he banked and rolled. He tried to absorb everything the veteran could teach him. The way a boy learns from a father he is desperate to make proud. On that hot August afternoon, Marshall led his flight of 4 Mustangs down toward a rail line, hunting for anything on the ground that could be shot to pieces and denied to the enemy. The target looked ordinary enough from above, a short string of freight cars sitting still on the tracks near a small French town. There was a red cross painted plainly on the side of one of the cars, the kind of marking that was supposed to mean sanctuary. The kind of marking that a decent man was trained not to fire. Then the trap sprang shut as the 4 fighters steadied onto their firing run. The wooden sides of that innocent-looking car fell suddenly away, and behind them crouched hidden anti-aircraft guns, their barrels already swinging up and around to follow the American airplanes. The gunners had been tracking the flight before the pilots ever understood what they were looking at. At the range, the Mustangs had closed to low and fast and committed. There was simply no way to miss. The storm broke over them almost at point-blank range. A wall of steel and fire climbed up into the very air where the fighters flew. And Bert Marshall, the man who always led from the front, was at the front of it now, exactly where his own courage had placed him. His fighter shuddered violently under the impact. One round punched deep into the Merlin engine below the exhaust stacks, and the smooth thunder of the motor broke into something ragged and wrong. A second round tore open the radiator scoop beneath the belly of the aircraft, and the lifeblood of that engine, the coolant that kept the great motor from tearing itself apart in the space of a minute, began streaming out in a pale ribbon into the rushing wind. Black smoke boiled back over the canopy. The Mustang had only minutes of flight left inside it, and every pilot in that flight understood the sum with a cold clarity. Lieutenant Priest watched it happen. He watched the airplane of the man he idolized stagger, drop its wing, and begin to fall, trailing fire and oily smoke, sinking down toward a wide field of golden wheat just behind the German line. The sight reached him somewhere far deeper than ordinary fear. The man he had followed across an entire ocean and into the middle of a war was about to burn alive in that field, or to disappear behind the wire for years that had no visible end. Marshall fought the dying fighter all the way down. He had no real choice left in where he would go. The wheat field rose up to meet him, gold and soft and terribly close. He set the crippled Mustang down among the standing stalks in a long, sliding, bone-jarring arrival that by every right should have killed him and somehow did not. The airplane plowed to a stop near the edge of a dark line of trees. Smoke, still climbing from its ruined engine into the summer sky. High above, the 3 surviving Mustangs of the flight wheeled and circled and watched, and this was the exact moment where the rules were supposed to take command. Every pilot in the group knew the procedure by heart. The way a man knows a prayer he has said 1,000 times. When a friend went down behind enemy lines, you fixed the spot in your mind. You called the coordinates back over the radio to the men whose grim job it was to attempt a proper rescue. And then you turned for the distant coast and you went home and you tried not to think about it. To land yourself and pull a man out was not merely frowned upon. It was considered flatly, physically impossible. The Mustang was built for one man and one man only. There was no second seat. There was no space. There was no plan for it. No training for it. No procedure written in any manual. Because in the entire war, no one had ever managed to do it and live. Royce Priest looked down at the smoke rising from that field. And he began to think the one thought a pilot was never supposed to think. He eased the nose of his own fighter over and started down toward the very same stretch of wheat where his commander had come to rest. The ground swelled up slowly toward him, greens and golds growing sharper with every second, and as it did, his radio crackled to life with a voice he knew better than almost any other on this earth. It was martial from the ground. From the last moments beside his broken machine, the squadron commander was ordering him away. Abort the run, turn around, go home, do not do this foolish thing. Priest's gloved hand moved toward the radio switch. He could answer. He could acknowledge the order the way a good and obedient officer was trained from his first day to do, roll his wings level, and point the airplane back toward England and toward safety and toward a long life. He could follow every rule anyone had ever handed him and let the Germans have his hero. His hand stopped in the empty air above the switch. He had already decided, not in his thought, but somewhere far below them, in the deep and stubborn place where a man keeps the few things he simply will not do. No matter what the cost, no matter who commands him otherwise, he was not going to climb away into the safe blue distance and leave Bert Marshall standing alone in a German field. He was going down. The Mustang was never built to land in a field of wheat. Everything about the machine argued against what Royce Priest was about to attempt. The liquid-cooled engine sat low in the nose, and the delicate radiator scoop hung down beneath the belly like an open wound waiting to happen. Any hidden rock, any half-buried log, any rut deeper than a boot could tear that scoop away and kill the engine in an instant. The landing gear had been designed for smooth concrete runways in the green English countryside, not for the soft, uneven, unknown earth of an enemy farm. A single hidden furrow could snatch a wheel, collapse a strut, and flip the whole airplane onto its back in a tangle of torn metal and spilling fuel. Priest ignored every one of those facts. He lowered his flaps, pulled his speed back until the airframe trembled on the edge of holding the air at all, and lined his nose up on the longest unbroken stretch of gold he could find. The great engine cowling rose up in front of him and blocked his view straight ahead, the way it always did in a nose-high approach, so he leaned to the side of the canopy and judged his height by the blur of the wheat stalks rushing past his wingtip, closer and closer, until the world was nothing but racing gold. The wheels struck the earth hard. The Mustang bounced once, heavily, then a second time, then settled and dug into the soft ground with a shuddering, dragging groan. Stalks whipped and hammered against the fuselage. Priest stood on the brakes with both feet, feeling the tail try to lift, feeling the whole machine fight him, until at last it slowed, staggered, and rolled to a stop not far from the tree line where his commander's burning airplane had vanished. He did not sit still for even a breath. The first thing he did, before anything else, was swing the fighter around 180 degrees to face back the way he had come in. If he was going to get out of this field, he would have to get out fast, and he could not afford to waste precious seconds turning the airplane while German soldiers closed in. The long axis of the field ran out ahead of him now, a narrowing ribbon of wheat with a dark wall of trees at the far end. It would have to be enough It was all he had, far above him. The two remaining pilots of his flight circled and watched, hardly able to believe what they had just seen a man do on purpose. Now their eyes swept the roads and the hedgerows and the farm tracks for the response they knew was coming. It came within seconds. A military truck appeared on a dirt road half a mile to the east, moving fast, throwing up a plume of dust behind it. The canvas cover stretched over its bed meant one thing, and one thing only. Infantry. A truck that size could carry 20 or 30 armed men, and they were coming straight for the field. The two Mustangs overhead rolled into their attack dives without a moment of hesitation. Each of them carried 6 heavy machine guns in the wings, and those guns together could pour out a wall of fire faster than the eye could follow. The lead pilot opened up while still well out, walking his bright tracers across the road and up into the engine of the truck. The vehicle swerved wildly, caught fire, and rolled hard into a ditch. Spilling its cargo, the second Mustang swept down behind him and raked the wreckage from end to end, making certain that no soldier who had been in that truck would ever reach the wheat field on his own 2 feet. But the circling pilots saw more movement, and their hearts sank. A second truck was grinding toward the field from the north. A motorcycle with a sidecar had appeared on a farm track to the south, bouncing over the ruts. The Germans were not sending one patrol. They were converging on the downed airplanes from every direction at once, like water running downhill toward the lowest point. And the lowest point was Royce Priest sitting in a field with a running engine. The clock was running now, and it was running fast. Priest half stood in his cramped cockpit and searched the tree line with desperate eyes for any sign of his commander. Smoke still rose from the woods where Marshall had gone down. But now, Priest knew the older man would have done his hard duty and set fire to his own airplane. Every pilot carried a thermite grenade for exactly that grim purpose, to burn a downed fighter to slag so that nothing of value, not the engine, not the gun sight, not the secret radio gear, could ever fall into enemy hands. The smoke meant Marshall was alive enough to do it, but alive and free were two very different things in a field. Crawling with soldiers. 1 minute passed. It felt like an hour. The Mustangs above made another howling, strafing run, this time on the motorcycle, scattering its riders into the shelter of a hedgerow. Priest did the brutal mathematics in his head while he waited. The soft ground had left deep, dragging ruts behind his wheels on the way in. Getting out would demand full power and every single foot of the field, and if by some miracle Marshall reached him, the added weight of a second-grown man crammed into a cockpit built for one would raise the speed at which the wings could lift and lengthen the run he needed to reach it. The numbers were merciless. He might not have enough field. He might get them both airborne, only to sink back into the trees. He might not get airborne at all. 2 minutes? Still no sign of the major. The second truck had stopped a quarter of a mile out. Through the shimmering heat, Priest could see small figures dropping down from its bed, spreading out into a long skirmish line, and beginning to push forward through the wheat toward him on foot. They were close enough now that he could see the shape of their helmets bobbing above the golden stalks. Then a single figure broke out of the tree line and began to run. It was Bert Marshall. His flight suit was black with soot. His face was twisted, and he was waving both his arms over his head as he ran. But he was not waving in greeting or in gratitude. He was waving in fury. He was ordering Priest, with every motion of his body, to leave him and go, to save the one airplane and the one life that could still be saved, to obey the order he had already given twice. And Royce Priest did the only thing left that he could think to do to answer him. He climbed up out of the cockpit and stood on the wing in the open, in full view of the advancing enemy. He unbuckled his parachute harness and let the whole rig slide off his shoulders and drop onto the wing at his feet. Then he stripped off the small survival raft he carried and threw it out into the wheat. He was throwing away his own survival, deliberately, piece by piece, so that his meaning could not be mistaken. Without the parachute, he could never bail out if the wounded engine failed somewhere over France. Without the raft, he would drown in the cold gray water if they went down in the channel. He was destroying every escape he had, and he was doing it where Marshall could see, so that the older man would understand there was no longer any version of this afternoon where Priest flew home alone. He was not leaving France without his commanding officer. He had just made that a physical fact. Marshall stopped running. He stood there in the wheat, perhaps 50 yards short of the airplane, staring at the discarded parachute lying on the wing and the raft flung out among the stalks. Behind him, the German helmets were rising higher out of the wheat, closer with every second. The Mustangs overhead had burned through nearly all their ammunition on the trucks and the motorcycle. They had one more pass in them, maybe two, before their guns ran dry and they became nothing but frightened spectators. Marshall made his choice. He sprinted the last distance to the airplane as hard as his soot-filled lungs would let him, and he scrambled up onto the wing. Now came the part that no one had ever solved, because no one had ever truly needed to. The cockpit of the Mustang was barely wide enough for one man wearing his bulky gear. It had been shaped and fitted around a single pilot in a parachute and a life vest, with nothing to spare in any direction. It was not made for two full-grown men. Marshall stood a shade under 6 feet and carried the solid frame of a former athlete. Priest was a little smaller, but still filled out his flight gear. Together they were being asked to fold themselves into a space meant for a single human being, and to do it in seconds, with an enemy line advancing through the wheat. Marshall climbed in first. He lowered himself down into the seat and pressed himself back and down as far as he possibly could, his spine against the armored plate behind the seat, his long legs stretched forward beneath the instrument panel and alongside the control stick. Then Priest climbed in on top of him, settling down onto his commander's lap, his own legs straddling the older man's thighs, his knees rising up on either side of the stick. Their bodies were pressed together as tightly as cargo jammed into a crate. The control stick jutted up between Priest's knees. His shoulders were mashed against Marshall's chest. Their two heads were crowded up under the glass. When Priest reached above him and dragged the canopy forward and latched it shut, there was barely a hand's width of space above his flight helmet. The two of them could hardly breathe. The August sun beat down through the canopy glass, and the little enclosed space turned into an oven within seconds. Sweat sprang out and soaked through both their flight suits almost at once. Priest's knees blocked part of the instrument panel from his view, but he could still see the gauges that would keep them alive or tell him they were about to die. Fuel pressure, oil temperature, the pressure in the engine. He wrapped his hand around the throttle and pushed it forward, and felt the Merlin engine come up to full roaring power beneath them, more than 1,000 horses of it, shaking the whole airframe. The propeller clawed at the hot air and dragged the badly overloaded fighter forward through the standing wheat. It accelerated slowly, far too slowly. The combined weight of two pilots, a full load of ammunition, and the remaining fuel had shoved the airplane well past the weight it had ever been designed to lift. The soft earth sucked and pulled at the wheel. Wheat stalks slammed and tangled against the radiator scoop underneath. Priest watched the airspeed needle crawl upward. 60, 70, 80, and the far tree line, the dark wall at the end of the field, came rushing toward the windscreen far faster than the needle climbed. A Mustang at its proper weight would lift off at around 100, loaded the way this one was. Priest guessed he would need a good deal more than that before the wings would hold him up, and the numbers on the dial were not getting there fast enough. The trees swelled up and filled the glass in front of him. He had run out of field. He pulled back on the stick anyway. Gently, coaxing, begging, and felt the wheels reluctantly leave the earth. The airplane staggered into the air, barely flying at all. Mushing, wallowing, the stall warning, shrieking its thin scream into both their ears. The tops of the trees rushed at them. He held the nose just so, not too high or the wings would quit, not too low or the trees would take them, and the branches passed beneath the belly by what felt like the width of a hand. Something scraped and rattled along the underside, and then they were over, and they were clear, and they were climbing slowly and painfully out over the open French countryside. Two men were folded into a single-seat fighter, alive against every reasonable expectation in the world. Behind them, the German soldiers reached the empty ruts at the edge of the field and stood watching the Mustangs shrink away to the west, their prize stolen out of their closing hands. But Priest and Marshall were nowhere near safe. The whole width of occupied France still lay between them and England. The airplane was dangerously heavy. The engine was already straining and beginning to overheat from the effort of dragging them off the ground. And somewhere ahead of them, out over that hostile country, German fighters were always hunting for stragglers and cripples, exactly like this one. The two surviving Mustangs of the flight slid into place on either wing as Priest labored up toward 8,000 feet. Their role had changed completely. They had almost nothing left to fight with, their guns nearly empty. So they could no longer protect the overloaded airplane by force, but they could ride alongside it, watch the sky in every direction, and guide their two friends home. It was not much. On that afternoon, it was everything. Priest leveled off and eased the power back to a gentler cruise setting. He had to. The temperature of the engine had been climbing without pause since the moment he firewalled the throttle in the wheat, and he needed to cool that Merlin before it cooked itself to death and seized solid. But the radiator scoop under the belly was packed with the wheat stalks and torn stems and dirt. It had scooped up during the long ground run, and the air that was supposed to flow through the cooling system and carry the heat away could barely get through it all. The temperature needle crept steadily toward the red line, minute by minute, and there was nothing he could do to stop it except fly gently and pray. The path home crossed a wide stretch of occupied France before it ever reached the Channel coast. German gun batteries dotted that whole route, any one of them able to reach up and swat them down. Enemy airfields lay scattered along the way, close enough that if a single spotter on the ground reported an American airplane crawling overhead, fighters could be climbing after them within minutes. Priest kept his altitude low enough to slip beneath the searching radar, but high enough that if the tortured engine finally quit, he might still stretch a glide to something like a survivable landing. It was a narrow band of sky to live in, and he flew at foot by careful foot. Inside the cockpit, the heat had become a torture all its own. The canopy trapped the fierce sun like the glass roof of a greenhouse, and there was no air, no relief, no room to move. Both men were soaked through and running with sweat, and Marshall, crushed underneath, had it far worse. Priest's full weight bore straight down on his outstretched legs, and within minutes the blood could no longer flow through them. His feet went numb first, then the numbness crept up through his calves, and then into his thighs, a cold deadness spreading through his lower body. He could not shift so much as an inch to relieve it. The narrow cockpit locked them both rigidly in place, one pressed down upon the other, like two men bound together in some medieval instrument of punishment, and there was nothing to do but endure it and count the minutes. Beneath him, Marshall said very little. There was little that could be said. Now and then, Priest felt the older man shift the smallest fraction against him, testing legs that no longer answered. And once he heard a low sound that might have been a word of encouragement and might only have been a man breathing through pain. The two of them had come to this war from opposite ends of experience, One was a green lieutenant who had idolized the other from a distance for years. The other was a decorated leader with a shelf of victories to his name, yet in that airless box, pressed together with a dying engine, hauling them across enemy country. All of that fell away, and they were simply two men who would live together or die together, joined more completely than most brothers ever are. Priest thought, in the small, clear part of his mind that was not busy flying, about the field they had just left. He thought about the German soldiers standing in the ruts, and about how close it had all come, and about the strange calm that had settled over him the instant he threw his parachute onto the wing. He had not felt brave. He had felt only certain, the way a man feels certain of his own name, whatever waited ahead of them now over the guns and the water. He would not have traded that certainty for the safety he had thrown away. Below the wings, the fields and hedgerows and little stone villages of occupied France slid past, quiet and green and deadly, each one a place where an ordinary farmer or a hidden gun crew might glance up and reach for a telephone. Priest could not afford to dwell on the pain, his own or his commander's. He had to fly. The control stick moved between his crowded knees with only the smallest range left to it. His elbows were jammed against the narrow cockpit walls and against Marshall's body, and every input he made had to be small and slow and perfectly judged. One sudden jerk of the stick could jam it against his commander's legs, or roll the wallowing overloaded airplane past the edge of control and drop them out of the sky. So he flew with his fingertips, gentle as a man carrying something that might shatter, all the long way across the enemy land. The escort pilots on the wings watched the engine cowling of Priest's Mustang with a growing dread they did not speak aloud over the radio. A pale streamer of coolant was trailing back from it. Now, a thin white ribbon in the slipstream, the visible sign that the Merlin was slowly boiling itself dry. They judged it had perhaps 15 or 20 minutes left before something inside it let go for good. And after that, there would be only the long, silent glide down toward whatever waited below. Priest saw the same story written on his gauges. He faced a cruel choice, and he had to make it alone. Folded into that oven, with his commander going numb beneath him. He could pull the power back even further to spare the engine and stretch out its life. But then the crawl home would take longer. And every extra minute over France was another minute for a gun or a fighter to find them. Or he could hold his speed, get across the coast as fast as this crippled machine could carry them, and simply gamble that the engine would hold together long enough to reach friendly water and friendly land. He chose speed. Better, he decided, to go down in the channel where rescue boats patrolled and a man had at least a slim chance, than to go down over occupied France where German patrols were already waiting in every field with their rifles raised. He nudged the throttle open a fraction, accepted the rising heat as the price of it, and pointed the shuddering nose toward the distant gray line of the sea. Every mile the engine held was a mile closer to home, and every mile was a gift he had no right to expect. The French coast fell away behind them, and the cold gray water of the channel opened up ahead, mile after mile of it, with nothing to land on, and no raft in either cockpit if the engine finally gave up the fight. Priest watched the temperature needle quiver against the red line and waited for the sudden, terrible silence that would mean the Merlin had surrendered at last. It did not come. The engine ran on, rough and hot and streaming its pale ribbon of coolant, but running mile after mile, carrying two men across the water it had no business crossing. Then the far shore rose out of the summer haze. Green fields, pale cliffs, the long, welcome outline of England. Solid and real and safe, they had crossed whatever happened now. They would come down among friends. Priest brought the crippled fighter down toward the home field of the group. the place they had both left that morning as one airplane each and were returning to as two men in one. The engine began to stumble and miss in the last miles, cylinders failing one by one, the steady thunder breaking up into a ragged cough. He coaxed it along, richened the mixture, and asked it for just a few more minutes. The airfield appeared through the haze, its runways crossing the flat Cambridgeshire farmland. Fire trucks and ambulances were already rolling into place along the strip. The escort pilots had radioed ahead, and word had raced through the base that something impossible was coming home. Priest carried more speed than usual into the pattern because the overloaded airplane needed it to keep flying. And he felt the reassuring thump of the landing gear locking down. The flaps came down in stages. The runway rose to meet them. He held the nose off, and the main wheels kissed the concrete, and the tail settled, and the Mustang rolled down the center of the strip with its engine coughing and sputtering, but still, somehow turning. He brought it to a stop, and for the first time in nearly 2 hours, the two men were still. Ground crews sprinted toward the airplane before the propeller had even stopped spinning. They expected a wounded pilot, perhaps a dying man who had nursed a shot-up fighter home on courage alone. What they found was something no one on that base had ever seen. Two full-grown men unfolded themselves out of a single cockpit, one after the other, like performers climbing out of a box that could not possibly have held them. Marshall could not walk. His legs, crushed beneath Priest's weight for the better part of 2 hours, had lost their blood and their feeling entirely, and when he tried to stand on the wing, they simply buckled beneath him. Ground crewmen caught him and carried him down and laid him in a waiting ambulance. Priest climbed out under his own power, his flight suit black with sweat, his hands shaking from exhaustion and from the adrenaline that was only now beginning to drain out of him. The word spread across the group within minutes, and pilots came from the base to stand around the airplane and see it for themselves. Wheat stalks stuck out of every opening in the airframe. The radiator was packed solid with crushed vegetation and dirt. Oil streaked back along the cowling where the tortured engine had begun to come apart. The crew chief looked it over and judged that the engine had been within seconds of seizing solid when Priest shut it down on the runway. It took the mechanics 2 full days to clean the machine, pulling wheat stubble out of the gear wells and the tail and the gun ports, taking the radiator apart entirely to dig out the packed debris, replacing cracked coolant lines, and giving the abused engine the long inspection it had earned. What Priest had done was without any precedent in the group. Other men had tried to land behind enemy lines to pull out a friend. Most of those attempts had ended in ruin, in an airplane flipped on soft ground, or wrecked against an obstacle, or shot to pieces before it could ever get airborne again. No one had landed a single-seat fighter in enemy country, loaded a second pilot into the cockpit with him, and flown home. Priest was the first. By the next morning, the story had climbed the chain of command all the way to the top, and it landed on the desk of the man who led the entire 8th Air Force, Major General James Doolittle, and it handed him a genuinely uncomfortable problem. Because Royce Priest had disobeyed a direct and lawful order from his commanding officer, in combat, not once but twice, he had gambled a valuable airplane and his own young life on a rescue no one had authorized. By the cold letter of military law, he should have faced a court-martial, yet he had also saved the life of one of the most promising squadron commanders in the whole European theater, an ace and a proven leader whose capture would have been a real and painful loss. The general knew a great deal about impossible decisions. 2 years earlier, he himself had led a flight of bombers off the deck of an aircraft carrier to strike the enemy homeland, knowing that not one of those airplanes could return, that they would all be lost when the fuel ran out. He had expected to be court-martialed for losing every airplane he commanded. Instead, his nation had given him its highest award for valor. Now he sat looking at a mirror image of his own past, a young pilot who had risked everything on an unauthorized mission and, against all odds, succeeded. The parallel was not lost on him. Doolittle called for the full reports. He read the radio transcripts and the statements of the escort pilots and the logs describing the wrecked condition of Priest's airplane. The facts were not in doubt. Priest had been ordered to abort, had acknowledged the order, and had gone down anyway. On the ground, Marshall had ordered him away again. And again, he had refused by every regulation that was a court-martial offense, and the punishments for it were severe. But Doolittle understood something the regulations could not hold. The 8th Air Force was losing experienced pilots faster than new ones could be trained to replace them, and every seasoned man who lived to fly again lengthened the odds for everyone around him. Marshall was not just any pilot. He was a leader whose fierce style had shaped the whole fighter group, and there was something even larger at stake. American pilots needed to believe in their bones that if they ever went down, their comrades would not simply mark the spot and fly away. Priest had proven, in the most dramatic way imaginable, that the bond between flyers could be stronger than fear, stronger than regulation, stronger than the fear of death itself. The general weighed it all for 3 days. He consulted his staff. He searched for a precedent that fit and found none, because no one had ever succeeded at this before. Then he made his decision. He would not court-martial Royce Priest. He would instead recommend him for a high decoration for valor. Yet Doolittle added a careful caveat, because he was troubled by the message a rescue like this might send. If he celebrated it too loudly, other pilots would try the same thing, and most of them would fail, and the cost of those failures would be counted in dead men and lost airplanes. He could not allow the 8th Air Force to encourage its pilots to gamble their lives and their machines on the slim chance of a miracle. So he chose the nation's second highest award for valor, rather than the very highest, the Distinguished Service Cross. It would honor the extraordinary courage of what Priest had done, while quietly making clear that such a thing must never become ordinary practice. The ceremony took place on a September afternoon on the flight line of the home field, with pilots from all 3 squadrons of the group drawn up to watch, and the ground crews pausing their work. Doolittle pinned the cross to the young lieutenant's chest. It was the same decoration the general himself had once received, and everyone present understood the quiet meaning in that. He held Priest's hand a moment longer and told him plainly why the very highest medal had been withheld. He had never once imagined he would need a rule forbidding pilots from landing behind enemy lines to rescue their friends, because the idea seemed so reckless, so utterly impossible, that no reasonable man would ever attempt it. Priest had proven that assumption wrong. What he had done was at the same time the bravest and the most foolish thing the general had seen in 2 years of command. The medal honored the bravery. The withheld medal acknowledged the foolishness. Priest accepted it without a word of protest. He had walked into that afternoon expecting a court-martial, not a commendation, and the cross was far more than he had ever dared to hope for. Long afterward, he would admit that the hardest part of the whole ordeal had not been the flight at all, terrifying as it was, but the waiting that came after, not knowing whether he would be honored or punished for saving the man he loved. Marshall recovered the feeling in his legs and was back in the air within days, leading his squadron again through the hard fighting of that autumn, adding to his tally and earning further honor for his leadership before the war was through. Both men survived to the end of it, and the bond that had been forged in a cockpit barely wide enough for one over enemy country with a dying engine and no parachutes between them never faded for the rest of their lives. Many years later, an aging Priest set the whole story down in a long letter to Marshall's son. He described the hidden guns, the burning fighter, the desperate landing, the airless torment of the flight home, and the fear of the court-martial that never came. Most of all, he wrote about why he had done it. Bert Marshall had been his hero long before the war ever started. When he saw that hero's airplane catch fire over France, he had not stopped to weigh the odds or the rules. He had simply refused to let the man he admired most in the world die alone in an enemy field. And so he had gone down after him and brought him home and asked for nothing in return but the sight of him living